There's only two places that evil can exist: in other people and in us. This section is about us. And that's sort of the most important, because that's the only evil that we can most effectively help to get rid of. However, even if we're working hard at it, we're going to look at why our evil can only be removed gradually. But first, how do you like that word that I'm using, evil? People have varying relationships with and definitions of that word, and it can be quite abrasive. So let's see if we can defang it a little bit. That word has been used to do a lot of shaming and blaming over the centuries, so it can bring up a lot of fear and guilt. But we need to be able to take a matter-of-fact view of it. Evil is simply an existing challenge to be aware of. In our physical lives, pollution, toxins, and germs are simply stuff that's around. Things we need to be aware of, and things we need to learn to get rid of as much as we can to keep them from taking over and ruining the health and balance of our bodies and environments. Evil is the spiritual equivalent. Just like we have to take showers and get medical help and clean our houses, we need to develop ways to spot and deal with the negativity that's just going to be there in our lives. It's nothing to feel shame about, just something to be aware of and to address. The first place to address evil is to start by being the change we want to see in the world. As Gandhi put it, if we could change ourselves, the tendencies in the world would also change. As a man changes his own nature, so does the attitude of the world change toward him. We need not wait to see what others do. In other words, we'll be more effective in helping to change others if we've done our inner work. As Jesus put it, how can you say to your neighbor, "Let me take the speck out of your eye," while the log is in your own eye? And then first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. That's also why Jesus preached that we have to start with the process of repentance, which means looking within and seeing what change has to happen so that the process of spiritual rebirth can get started. That change can't happen all at once. It is a natural human tendency to want things to happen instantly. But all of life shows us that any genuine progress in complicated systems can only happen gradually. For instance, learning a skill, getting healthy or in shape, forming or repairing a relationship, replacing bad habits with better ones. Gradually is the only way that lasting change happens. As Psychology Today put it, there's only one way to change: slowly over time. The same is true for our spiritual growth and the spiritual growth of humanity. We've established that the outer levels of our minds are currently born into this state of spiritual dysfunction. So a crucial part of spiritual growth is getting ego negativity, or evil, out of the way. Evil simply means harmful. Harmful to others and harmful to ourselves. Evil has to be resisted and removed, because evil blocks the heavenly goodness that God is trying to pour into our lives and into the world. Once we start to be aware of harmful habits and tendencies in ourselves, it can be distressing. It's natural to wish that God would just take it away instantly. Or we blame ourselves that we should be already over this by now. But you don't need to beat yourself up about that, because the good/bad news is it can't work like that. It can't go away all at once. For real, positive change to happen, there is an orderly process to have the change be genuine and sustainable. A popular misconception is that the state of our life can be changed instantly so that we become good instead of evil. We cannot become good instead of evil in an instant and be let out of hell and transported into heaven except by the ongoing efforts of divine providence from our infancy to the end of our lives. All the laws of divine providence are aimed at our reformation and therefore at our salvation, which means inverting the hellish state into which we are born into its opposite, a heavenly state. This can be done only gradually as we move away from evil and its pleasure and move into what is good and its pleasure. People who hold this kind of belief have no idea whatever of what evil and good really are. They do not really know that evil is the pleasure we find in the urge to act and think in violation of the divine pattern, and that goodness is the pleasure we feel when we act and think in harmony with the divine pattern. Whoa! Let's stop and absorb that a bit. Evil is taking pleasure in violating the divine pattern, and good is taking pleasure in harmonizing with the divine pattern. But how do we know if we're violating or harmonizing with the divine pattern? Let's review what we learned in lesson 1. Goodness is taking pleasure in letting God's heavenly love flow through our inner self into our outer lives, staying turned toward God's love and wisdom for guidance, keeping ideas and opinions united with love and compassion, and using resources in the ways that God intended. And the opposite, evil, is taking pleasure in closing the door to God and our inner self, turning toward worldly opinions and our own opinions for guidance, separating ideas and opinions from love and compassion, and using resources for self-centered gratification. For example, that little rush of pleasure when somebody that we don't like runs into problems, or they lose the game, or they lose the opportunity, that's a lower self-pleasure. And we can't help starting out taking our primary pleasure in self-centered and worldly concerns and gratifications, and seeking guidance from worldly opinion and our own opinion. We've inherited those tendencies. It is the only place we can start. Pleasure is spiritual food. If God were to take away all that lower self-pleasure, the lower self-comforts, before we've had a chance to evolve into an appetite for higher pleasures and comforts, our spirits could not survive. There would be no motivation to do anything, no pleasure in anything, not even any basis for thinking. We have to be gradually weaned off of lower self-pleasures into higher self-pleasures. In part because each simple pleasure that we experience is actually made up of a whole network of feelings. People do not realize that there are thousands of individual impulses that go to make up any particular evil, and that there are thousands of individual impulses that go to make up any particular good tendency. These thousands of impulses are so precisely structured and so intimately interconnected within us that no single one of them can be changed without changing all the rest at the same time. What we take pleasure in has to get very gradually shifted, one impulse at a time. And this kind of thing is mirrored in the brain with anyone who's trying to change habits or break addictions.
prior to about 1990, the assumption was that babies, children, adolescents, they all were growing very fast, not only physically, but also in their brain. They were learning. That's why we set up schools, because we know they learn so much in the first 20 years of life. But there was an assumption that was taught to me back in the 1970s. There was an assumption that once you hit adulthood, that from then on, the brain just sort of deteriorates. It gets older and we forget things and there's no growth. That was what we thought. But we no longer think that. Now that we have the machines that can detect that there's actually change happening. If you think about the brain as sort of like this shape here, underneath and the lower part is our emotional center of the brain. It's called the limbic system, and there are many little parts. Not too far away from that is another central part of the brain, and that's called the ACC, the anterior cingulate cortex, ACC. What its function is kind of like the conscience. It's where we think about, how do I regulate what I am feeling, what I'm going to do, what I shouldn't do, and that feeling of, uh-oh, I just made a mistake. All of that self-awareness and self-regulation, it was what goes on in the ACC. And what's amazing is that now with the neuroscientists having these machines, they can see which parts of the brain are active. So one study I was reading about said that they took some people who were incarcerated, that means they're in prison, and they have a history of committing atrocious murders, but they seem to have no remorse. Some people call them psychopaths or having antisocial personality disorder. When you put them into the fMRI and ask them a few questions that might trigger their conscience, the ACC is almost quiet. Hardly anything is happening. And structurally, there doesn't seem to be very many neurons there. In other words, at a physical or physiological level, we can change our brain to be less functional or more functional. In other studies, when they put people into this fMRI, people who are devoted to prayer and service to others, people like nuns, they put them in there and they have a very well-developed ACC. Their conscience is very alive and they have probably intended to make that a strong part of their brain. Remarkable. It gives me a clue that we can actually change our brain. The scientists that are studying the brain and Swedenborg are both telling us about the word intent or intention, that we intend to do something. Swedenborg tells us that the Lord gives us the opportunity to change our inner self. We can either shut it down and not pay attention to it, or we can develop it. Here's what Swedenborg tells us. The Lord has foreseen and arranged matters in such a way that the more we derive our thoughts and intentions from heaven, the more our inner spiritual self opens and takes shape. This is an opening to heaven all the way to the Lord, and a taking shape in accord with the priorities of heaven. I think of that quote as telling me that we have an opportunity to change our brain. We can develop our anterior cingulate cortex or our conscience. We can change if we intend to do so, if we're purposeful in what we're trying to do with our lives. This doesn't happen very quickly. This happens very slowly. And I think the brain evidence, as well as what we read in Swedenborg's writings, tell us that we need to change slowly. In the area of spiritual growth, for the last year at least, I've been trying to do something every day. I'm trying to create a new habit. And perhaps in my brain, the neurons are arriving to strengthen a certain part of my brain. And it helps to know from the neuroscientists that new neurons are arriving every day. And I have an opportunity to strengthen certain parts of my brain if I intend it. So here's my little ritual I've been creating. Every morning when I get up, I like to look out the window at the east and see the morning sun. I like to imagine the Lord's face in that morning sun. I always think of the east as where the Lord is. And so while I'm being basked in that beautiful sunrise, I like to think, Lord, please help me be a better person. And then I put on some hand cream and I rub my hands just to get the cream all over my hands. And while I'm doing that, I often do a little prayer and I say, Lord, help me to be more patient and more compassionate and have more empathy for the people in my life, both the people in my household, the people in my extended family, the community at large, and even politicians and leaders of the world who are trying very hard to do the right thing. I find that during other parts of the day that if I'm feeling an old habit of maybe being critical of somebody I'm listening to or cynical about something I read in the news, I go like this and I try to recall that prayer. Try to be more patient. Ask the Lord to give you that feeling of compassion for others. Then I try to visualize physiologically. Maybe new neurons are moving over to that direction and trying to make new connections about what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, what I'm seeing, and hopefully developing new spiritual habits. The neuroscientists have an analogy that they write about, and that is they say, if you think about it, as new things are happening, old things are fading away. And they use a phrase called pruning. Think about a gardener who goes into their garden and they are going to prune away branches of a rose bush and they don't need them anymore. And they want to keep just the best of the rose bush for next year's bloom. I'm going to use these as sort of an example, these little pipe cleaners. So they prune away what is no longer needed and just keep the best. Well, it's not exactly like cutting, but there is a melting away in the brain that they can now see with their equipment, their microscopes. They can actually see how old neurons are melted away. I think of that as an analogy of how we're getting rid of old habits. Again, it may not happen quickly, but it certainly is powerful to know that we can start anew with new habits and start creating spiritual growth.
So think in terms of gradual replacement in our spirits. Negative elements, negative thoughts, motivations, ways of acting can be slowly swapped for good ones throughout our life. God doesn't want us to have no ability to think and feel and experience pleasure. So we're going to be led along at a pace we can handle. Let's recap. Evil is something that exists in every one of us as part of the human condition. By identifying it, we can partner with God to get rid of it. But because we start out acclimated to negative tendencies, and because of the complexity of our spirits and the feelings that we have, the transition has to happen slowly. In the next lesson, we'll take a deeper look at why it has to be gradual, and also look at why sometimes things have to hit rock bottom before progress can happen.